So, great, we're going to resume
Empezamos con la primera ponencia
with the
marco de esta
first
tarde.
keynote
Estamos en el marco
presentation
de
for this
exponer y hemos
afternoon.
invitado
I don't really know how to pronounce this in German. Beatrice von Gisman,
Beatrice von Bismarck,
professor of history in the Fine
professora
Arts
di storia
Academy
dell'arte
in Leipzig,
di
where
cultura visual
she teaches
dell'Accademia
about
de Bellas Artes de Leipzig.
curating
Ese es el tema
techniques.
por el que
This is the
hemos invitado,
main
porque ella ha hecho muchos trabajos de
reason why
comisariado
we have
y
invited
trabaja mucho
her.
en culturas de
She
comisariado.
works
Inició un
also in
programa de
a
máster
master's
en
program
otoño 2009, también en
in
Leipzig,
Leipzig,
y
and
ha
she
trabajado
has
en diferentes
been
instituciones de todo el mundo,
engaged in
Moscú, Alemania,
institutions all
Beirut.
around the world, in
Ha publicado muchos
Moscow,
libros
Beirut. She has
y el
published a
último,
long list of books, and one
uno
of
de
the
los que nos
last
ha
ones
influenciado para
that she
invitarla
published is
es
the
The Curatorial
Curatorial
Conditions,
Condition, published in
que publicó en
2022.
2022. Empezará ahora, la hemos invitado
We have
porque hemos
invited
creído
her
que
because
era muy
we
adecuada
believe
para esta
her
idea de
approach will
exponer y
be
porque habla mucho
very
de
much welcome. She speaks about
comisariado como trabajo en sí
curating
mismo, con sus
as a
estructuras.
job with its own
Y
structures,
por lo tanto,
etc.
ahora esta ponencia
So she
Marcos,
will be
pues
in charge of the
presentamos
keynote
a la
presentation for this afternoon, and then we'll introduce
conducirá toda la
Mela, who
conversación de la
will be
tarde.
facilitating the afternoon's debate. The floor is yours. Muchísimas gracias. Muchísimas gracias, Nina, y a los responsables de la organización de esta conferencia. Gracias por haberme invitado. Es un honor y un placer estar aquí para debatir sobre la relación existente entre lo que yo llamo las prácticas archivísticas y prácticas culturales, una con la otra. Es lo que voy a intentar hacer durante los próximos 40 minutos. En la narrativa actual sobre archivos, la función y los efectos, a menudo resulta una extensión natural al entorno público, como si el interior archivístico pudiese reflejarse uno a uno con el espacio epicúreo, las actividades y procesos que tienen lugar en el proceso de exposición y que desarrollan el hecho, siguen en el trasfondo siempre y cuando la impresión de este espejo sea preservado. No obstante, lo que queda completamente fuera en tal interpretación de los archivos expuestos son los procesos inminentes de producción del significado del acto de comisariado. Los elementos que componen un ejercicio de comisionado son actos de reposición que, por norma general, implican un cambio de una situación relativa. Dentro de estas nuevas relaciones y dentro de las mismas, el significado y estatus de las partes implicadas se ve alterado. Desde este punto de vista, los archivos y el material archivístico es sometido a cambios cuando se expone. Además, es el resultado de las diferencias entre los archivos y su exposición. El primero toma forma en su propia construcción, en otras palabras, además de la desviación de la situación de comisariado del archivo, pues las condiciones en las que el archivo adopta forma ponen de manifiesto las condiciones del archivo y siguen existiendo las mismas hoy en día y puede que sigan existiendo en el futuro. En este contexto, al ser expuestos, los archivos se abren a otras formas de participación y de funcionalidad y se abren a futuras escrituras e interpretaciones de la historia, a relatos de futuro. Los elementos necesarios son las facultades y métodos a través de las cuales el acto del comisariado contribuye a la producción de significado a través del diseño y forjado de relaciones. A primera mirada, el archivo y la exposición tienen una relación sinérgica, comparten prácticas de selección, ensamblaje de materiales que están en formas diferentes, son el resultado de la investigación que es expuesta en presentaciones públicas, se elaboran conclusiones que ilustran lo que está archivado. La exposición garantiza la visibilidad y difusión para su relevancia académica. La práctica de comisariado participa en las prácticas de selección a través de las cuales los materiales encuentran su lugar en los archivos, así como los archivos también son fuente de inspiración de entornos de investigación. Lo que está archivado se convierte en materia prima y bueno, los críticos, los artistas, los comisarios, los académicos y representantes de otras disciplinas y campos, como por ejemplo los coleccionistas y marchantes de arte, diferentes profesionales se encuentran en el espacio conectando el interior del archivo y el exterior, la exposición en este caso. Habiendo ya reflexionado sobre todas estas relaciones sinérgicas y, no obstante, cuando ésta se expone, pues no se puede considerar un estado natural del archivo, ya que la práctica archivística y de comisariado difieren en su enfoque. Se ubican en dos tareas centrales. Por una parte, la preservación y por otra parte, la mediación. Si bien en el archivo la supervivencia permanente del material recolectado define la legitimidad esencial y el objetivo de la actividad llevada a cabo, en el acto del comisariado se pone el foco en el material compilado y en su naturaleza pública por un periodo de tiempo. Así pues, se permite una reubicación del material archivado junto con materiales no archivados, así como con
archival and curatorial practice results in further differences, and these concern the meaning and function of the expertise and training of the people involved, the status of the order and the context that archives and curatorial situations establish, the relevance of permanence and temporality of the individual, human and non-human participants, but also, and quite essentially, of their respective assembly. The spectrum of the different modes of relating that archive and exhibition develop for the human and non-human contributors unfolds between these poles of preserving and becoming public. In this respect, curatorial ways of dealing with archives can ignite heated debates. Their starting point is ultimately the disputed participation in the production of meaning on the part of archival and curatorial practices. While some emphasize the service-providing function of curating, which is primarily committed to the expertise of those who selected, organized, and now research the archival material, others insist that every curatorial situation generates a difference that goes beyond the previous meaning of the individual contributors as well as of the previous contexts. The arguments expand on the general discussion about the tasks and potentials of curation as an independent, meaning-generating cultural practice that has been going on since the 1960s among actors in the art field, especially among artists, critics, and curators. What is contested is the power with which the archive writes history, laws, and norms, participates in their preservation, and brings them to bear in socio-political terms. The precondition that enable and regulate access to archives, and thus their use in general, art at issue. Disciplinary backgrounds and the corresponding expertise are just as much a part of this as the professional positions, as are the professional positions as archivist, curator, scientist, or artist, and that list can be extended. And yet, historically, archival and curatorial fields of work originally merged in the figure of the curator. According to the German philosopher Stefan Nowotny, its development can be traced back to the curatores re publica around the year 100, who had the public good in mind, but also the preservation of order and law. However, as professions in the art field became differentiated in the 1960s particularly, the work of the archivist of collections or the collection curator and that of the developing independent curator began to become separate. This development involved different role definitions whereby those bound to an institution were also committed to it in terms of content, socially and economically, while those with a certain degree of institutional independence structured their work in a project-like manner, following subjectivized perspectives in dealing with institutionally archived material. Moreover, curatorial engagement with archives complemented the effects of change that go hand in hand with their use. Every interaction with the archival institution and its holdings generates dynamics as additional agents join in who bring with them and develop their own properties, experiences, and histories, and who relate in different ways to the histories and experience already attached to the institution and its holdings. With an understanding of archive less as a storage, and I think this is what we are talking about over the course of those 2 days, less as a storage than as a system, performance theoretician and curator André Lepecki speaks of the body in dance as an archive whose movement within the archive can result in its rewriting. Entering an archive entails disorder and difference. The body, as Lepecki quotes choreographer, researcher, performer and curator Martin Nakbar, makes, I quote, the archive visible and at the same time creates this difference, unquote. To this dynamizing effect, the curatorial approach adds its specific dual orientation through which two opposing movements take place simultaneously. And by these two opposing movements, I mean, on the one hand, the orientation towards the interior of the archive, towards its inventory and its constitution and continued existence. And on the other hand, the orientation towards the outside, towards presentation and towards becoming public. In this interaction of assembling and becoming public, as it is constitutive for the curatorial, a moment of tension arises that insists on changeability and mobility. By exposing the archive as a rearrangement, placed, as it were, outside of itself, The curatorial approach poses a challenge on two levels. First, it relativizes the parameters under which the demarcation of the institutional space from the outside world takes place and allows the archive, with its external boundary becoming porous, to become evident in its internal and external relationships. Second, the transfer into the public sphere threatens to weaken the legitimacy and binding force of the order created in the archive with its legislative effects. The claim to evidence associated with the presentation of documents is relativized here. Two characteristics essential to curatorial practice come to bear here. On the one hand, constellation, and on the other, transposition. As discussed in more details elsewhere, constellation is the interaction of human and non-human participants in a curatorial situation, all of whom enter from their previous contexts into a new one and undergo changes in this transformed relationality. Archivists, artists, curators, researchers, the various archived materials and their respective mediality, the discourses associated with them, and the institutions enter new relationships with one another, and through that are endowed equally with agency as players in that relationality, in that new situation. The fabric of relations as a constellation is thus temporary, changeable, and performative. And thus it has an agential power that affects the elements gathered in it as well as those who gather around it. The concept of the transposition, which is the second concept, encompasses the acts of transformation that accompany the change of relative placement of all participants. Humans and not humans undergo shifts from one spatial, temporal, social, aesthetic, economic, cultural, or discursive context into another. In the transfer from archive to exhibition space, from document to exhibit, from the private to the public, changes occur in meaning. Transfers between media, languages, disciplines, and cultures are from then on inscribed in the history of the participants as Arjuna Padurai would put it, as their social life. Transformations of professional roles or social positions of function and status are among the essential experiences of those involved in a curatorial situation. Through their new constellation and relations, all participants in a curatorial situation experience such processes of transformation, the specific mode of positioning as, I quote, a result of movement, and I quote Michael Schwab, who has published a volume on transpositions. In the sense of, I quote again, reworking the interrelations among different differences, unquote. To use the words of the philosopher and feminist theoretician Rosi Braidotti, who has been vital to shaping the concept of transposition, transposition is a method that enables a critical engagement with existing divisions and differentiations. Against this backdrop, the curatorial is a dynamic constellation of relations that it shapes and through which it is shaped itself. It is the site of and impulse for formation of different modes of relation among the participants. The artist and cultural theoretician Hito Steyerl insists on the political potential of such other relations in her discussion of Walter Benjamin's concept of language theory. She takes up his notion of the language of practice, which mediates between the languages of things and those of people, to emphasize the form in which this mediation takes place. In doing so, she makes the distinction between a form that, I quote, creates ruling subjects and subordinate objects, unquote, and the one that engages instead with, I quote again, the energies of the material world, unquote. The form, so the either or, decides whether things are functionalized for the purpose of representation, or whether in the spirit of rendering them present, they, I quote again, can become creative in the sense of a transformation of the relations which define it, unquote. Steyerl also complements this juxtaposition of functionalization or functionalizing fixation versus creative productivity in the process of translation with a warning not to be seduced and overwhelmed by the forces of things in the interest of an unreflective fetishization. Her concern is with, and I quote her again, presencing precarious, risky, at once bold and preposterous articulations of objects and their relations, which still could become models for future types of connections, unquote. This politically transformative potential of other, different connections finds resonance in the concept of modes of relating developed by the German political theorist Bini Adamczak with regards to revolutionary movements. For Adamczak, social transformations involve the shifting of relations, the transformation of those connections that make up, I quote her, the ensemble of human relationships, but also include unhuman, non-human participants. From this relational theoretical perspective, she describes institutions as, I quote, solidified or reified, codified, materialized and ritualized modes of relating, unquote. Making these ways of relating available again, a prerequisite for change, can, according to Adamczak, only be thought of in plural collective participation in new connections. Finally, an image. Okay, thanks. To elaborate such shifts of relations through curatorial practice in dealing with archives, I would like to sketch out briefly three positions. The first is the Kinjeketile suite by Franco-Canadian artist Kavani Kivanga, which was shown in 2015 at the South London Gallery in London. Kivanga presented a multimedia installation which focused on two pivotal moments in the history of Tanzania. The Maji Maji rebellion triggered by the spiritual medium Kinjeketile Ngwale in 1905, and Tanganyika's independence in 1961, led by Pan-African activist Julius Nyerere and his social urama governance. She, Kivanga, combined a range of archival material, including photographs, magazines, political pamphlets, fabrics and plants, arranged on series of wooden structures. Short audio vignettes interspersed throughout the installation, and performances by actors lend a multi-voiced and fragmented narrative to the installation. The two historical events bring memory, folklore, and history together in the formation of the Tanzanian collective national identity. The combination of material, what I show you here are two kind of general views of the exhibition and some of the details in which it becomes obvious that you can actually look through these wooden installations and through the difference of material that gets combined through the installational display medium. The combination of materials that stemmed from diverse historical and functional contexts was further enhanced through the presentational strategies. While the transparency of the wooden constructions allowed for repeated recombinations and overlappings between the exhibited elements, the sonic parts and performances created changing exhibitionary contexts which traversed different histories and narratives. The strategies thus employed were those of transformation, reactivation, and bringing to life again, of dispersing with the separation of document and fiction, history and myth, fact and metaphor, past and potential futures. Making the archival material, amongst others from the University College of Dar es Salaam, public through the means of a curatorial constellation, allowed for critical analysis of the preconditions of the construction of histories. At the same time, it meant a revitalization and legitimation of different voices and approaches to play a part, a hitherto avoided part or hitherto not possible part, in the draft of other socio-political futures. The German cultural sociologist Sophia Prinz and the Austrian curator Roger Birgel, that's my second example, showed an exhibition called Mobile Worlds in 2018 at the Museum of Arts and Crafts in Hamburg. Vitrines, I'll show you another. This is the website in which you just see an assembly of the different materials and the display modalities that they have been working on. Vitrines, display furniture, and exhibition architecture organized visitors' passes through a mesh-like configuration, enabling both a view of the objects on display, archaeological findings, artworks, handicrafts, items from everyday and from popular culture, and an understanding of their mobility across various continents and centuries. The exhibition's compilation marked a decisive departure from the conventions of museum arrangement and classification, which generally foreground place and date of origin, provenance, style, material, genre, or categorical distinctions between art, popular culture, and craft. Instead, in the form it was shown in Hamburg, they allowed new connections to emerge, associations that incorporate and assign equal value not only to objects of varying media, formats, and categories, but to different disciplines, fields of knowledge, and research practices as well. New connections that disrupt and undermine traditional museum systems of order turn not least the institution into an object of investigation. The Mobile Worlds exhibition contrasted these consequences of human and object mobility with a curatorial processuality that emphasized aspects of multiple and complex interconnections over difference and separateness. Distancing itself from the outcomes of infrastructurally enabled violence, it employed display strategies that established different modes of relation among all participants. And this meant, for example, at the material infrastructural level, not using display furniture such as traditional museum cabinets, shelves, showcases, pedestals, or boxes to support the logic of separation, but rather subjecting them, and I think you can see that on these two images quite well, rather subjecting them, like all other objects in the exhibition, to a recontextualizing examination of the historical and present function and status. While they have served museum conventions in line with collection established criteria and classification, and have become the rigidifying means by which objects from the life world are transformed into collection holdings, their use in the Hamburg exhibition oscillated between medium and independent exhibit without ever fully becoming subsumed into one or the other status. Domestic furniture from the Vier Landen area, that's in the countryside near Hamburg, served as cabinets, pedestals, or showcases, but there were also exhibits that shared their coveted collector's item status with other exhibits around, on, and in them. And the last example. The third one is a project by Kader Attia, a multi-part project which started in an exhibition in Zurich in 2020 with the title The Objects Interlacing, and continued then as a multi-parted project under the title Fragments of Repair at the BAC in Utrecht in 2021, and it is consisted of 22 objects, a video, and then in BAC a multiple projection of different interviews, conversations, discussions with participants in hybrid formats and different phases. Central to Kader Attia's practice, which focuses on the impact of colonial conditions historically and in the present, is the notion of repair. He himself writes, I quote, "Behind this single word, repair, so many synonyms seem to emerge. Reappropriation, reconstruction, transformation, increase, improvement, reenactment, translation, remembering, and, metaphorically, reparation, justice, equality, rebalancing." To imbue the repairing practice with these effects, Attia makes clear that he defines it not as the re-establishment of a former state that was previously destroyed, but on the contrary, as the acceptance of the ever-present signs of violation and destruction. I quote him again. "Keeping the wounds visible is to accept the real. So I undertook to repair these wounds by pursuing what my research taught me was fundamental, that repair is an oxymoron that also includes the wound. To deny it is to maintain it. In addition to the various techniques he employs to keep these wounds alive in single objects, Attia employs specific presentational strategies, exhibiting his installation, the objects interlacing, which combines sculptural as well as filmic elements, in the context of Bach, not only enhanced the discursive character, but also the process orientation of the notion of repair in terms of a continuous mode of rediscussion, redoing, recontextualizing through the constellational means of an exhibition. These three strategies of transformation, mobilizing and repairing, exemplary unfold what other modes of relating can mean for curatorial approaches to archives, regardless of their respective professional backgrounds and occupational fields. These practices are characterized by features that can be understood as curatorial along the parameters that I've described above. Key features common to their approaches are a process-oriented understanding of archives, an extension of practice to multiple contributors, human as well as non-human, and a situated understanding of that practice. The arrangements, which in this sense are understood as constellational, each intertwine different contexts. The procedures traverse various arts, media, aggregate states, disciplines, and discourses. They establish relations between different historical times, between forms of temporal processes and interruptions. They dissolve status attributions just as they make the legitimacy and binding nature of institutional norms, orders, and protocols porous. They perform thus transpositional movements with which not only relations are newly established, but these also change in their quality. Approaches such as these respond to the archival violence of which Jacques Derrida speaks, in that they counter the archontic principle of the archive, the unification of signs that the archive engages in, each in a different way with processual extensions, multiplications, and heterogeneity. If, according to Derrida, archiving produces the event to the same extent that it records it, curatorial practice does not allow this process to come to a halt in the assembly, but keeps it in motion again through exposure. In this movement, what has just been fixed in one place is redistributed, widening the circle of possible participants, potentially as far as the commons. Not only the elements gathered in the archive, but the archive itself shows itself with its conditions and effects. The differences it defined, primarily the ones between past and present, lose their durability by being confronted in the curatorial process with other differentiations in which the categories of what previously permissible, mediably suitable, and legitimized dissolves. For neither access to and participation in the curatorial approach remains limited to a few, nor are possessions, objectivity, and completeness considered the guiding claims. Instead, Curatorial work with archives is defined by many voiced participatory strategies, by resituating, subjectivizing procedures that undermine reification as well as any final definition of history. They emphasize multi-perspectivity, ongoing work on the production of meaning, and the importance of mediation. This is not about discoveries in the archive, which would ultimately consolidate the existing archival logic, but about other ways in which the archive and all those affected by it relate to one another. It brings to the fore an ethical, a caring dimension of curatorial relation building. And if we want to take the origin of the curatorial in the Latin curare, to care for, literally, then the strength of positions like these lies in transformative caring for such other ways of relating. Thank you very much.